Well, this book began as a labor of love, mostly comprised of my own notes, my own rituals that I wrote and presented to my local community, as well as national and international conventions. So a lot of the material has been beta tested, if you will. And for quite some time, I had no intention of publishing my work. However, I do know Jack Grail, and if others know Jack Grail, you would all know that he is quite persuasive. So he convinced me to submit my work for publication. The first publishing company, there wasn't much reception. And then I submitted it to Anathema, and it's been happily ever after. The premise, if you will, the book consists of 4 key parts. The first part is essentially a primer into the culture, into the religious and spiritual traditions. It also highlights the specific gods and spirits that one will encounter in the text. So there are a total of 24 gods that one will interact with to some degree. And in addition to those 24 gods, there will be the attending spirits of those gods, the attending spirits of humanity on a singular level. So the reader, or in this case, the initiate, or as the book highlights, the supplicant, will be introduced to 2 gods, a god and a goddess, who will attend to them through the course of the book. The second portion of the book is a more in-depth initiation. So one will be encountering the gods of the earth, of the earthly sphere, who ordain the seasons, who oversee civilization on a more intimate scale. The third part of the text will involve a descent into the underworld, in which specific underworld or chthonic deities are encountered, more or less in the sense of the descent myth of Inanna. So in a way, the reader is mirroring that myth, or entering or engaging in a mythopoetic journey or ritual. After the encounter with the gods of the underworld and a, spoiler alert, symbolic death, the reader is then initiated into the realm or spheres of heaven, in which they encounter the prime movers and shakers, or the 7 who decree fate, that oversee universal order and heavenly ordinances. Certainly, for those who are not familiar with the integral myth, the most prolific myth of Inanna, the myth details Inanna's gathering of her powers, also known as the May, in preparation for her descent into the underworld. Now, in order to understand this myth, one has to read the accompanying myth, if you will, the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which the bull of heaven is killed in battle. And as a follow-up to that specific scene in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Inanna prepares herself, or Ishtar prepares herself, stutter there, to descend into the underworld, gathering her May, or one would essentially call them her regalia, that represent her divinity, represent her power and authority over various aspects of creation, civilization. So as she approaches the gates of the underworld, she demands to be let into the underworld, let in through the gates, the 7 gates specifically, under the ruse of going into the underworld to lament the death of the bull of heaven, who in the myth is Ereshkigal's first spouse. Knowing, however, that her entrance into the underworld is far from a lamentable or a grief-stricken aspect, Ereshkigal knows that Inanna has essentially come to battle for the throne. So she is wearing her garments, which are not in line with what one would wear if one were actually to partake in a funerary ritual. In a funerary ritual, one would actually be wearing sackcloth, one would be wearing dust, one would be in a lamentable state. So here Inanna is in all of her finery, much like a wedding invitee who shows up in a white dress to upstage the bride. So she approaches the gates of the underworld. Ereshkigal knows what Inanna is there for, or what Ishtar is there for. So she instructs her attendant who guards the 7 gates to allow the goddess in, to allow Inanna or Ishtar in. However, at each gate, she is to remove an article of her regalia in order to pass into the underworld, because those are quote unquote the decrees or the laws of the underworld, and the decrees of the underworld are perfect and not to be questioned. So at the end of her journey through the 7 gates, Inanna is stripped of all of her regalia, of her identity as a goddess who oversees creation, who oversees these aspects of civilization. So naked and brought low before Ereshkigal's throne, she's essentially, again, stripped of her power. However, in that process, Ereshkigal rises from her throne. Now, Inanna already possesses the powers of heaven. She possesses the powers of earth. And the minute Ereshkigal rises from her throne, Inanna plots to take over the powers of the underworld. So if one were to read the myth, it indicates that Ereshkigal, having risen from the throne, leaves that throne empty. And in that moment, Inanna, or Ishtar in the Akkadian version, rises from her crouched position and makes towards the throne so she can actually take over the throne, sit on the throne of the underworld, take over the underworld as the ruler of that 3rd and final realm. However, in that moment, Ereshkigal sees what she has done. So she utters the cry of guilt. The gods of the underworld, the judges of the underworld, issue their decree. Inanna is struck dead by a god of plagues, and her body is hung from a hook. So for 3 days, and this is a myth that has parallels in other myths and other cultures. So for 3 days, Inanna is dead. During that time, life on Earth essentially comes to a halt. While everyone exists, the powers of fertility, the coupling of livestock in the fields, the coupling of humans to produce more children is ceased. It's abruptly ceased. So knowing that this has happened, Inanna's attendant or vizier, also known as a sukal, her attending goddess, Ninshibor, is instructed by Inanna or Ishtar prior to the descent. If I do not return, please go to my father, my grandfather, and my uncle. If each turns you away in turn, move on to the next. So she initially starts, Ninshibor, Inanna's attendant, initially starts by petitioning the god Enlil, who is the chief of the gods. Enlil states that he will not intervene. Ninshibur then goes to Inanna's own father, Nana, the moon god, and he states that he will not intervene. He actually washes his hands of Inanna's fate. Ninshibur is then instructed, prior to the events that led to Inanna's death, is then instructed to go to Enki, or Yah, who is the magician of the gods, the creator of humanity in some iterations of myth. Knowing what has happened, knowing that Inanna possesses the powers that oversee civilization, the powers that oversee the order of creation, by possessing the May, there's no one to possess those May or to distribute that power. That's my personal interpretation in that aspect. So he is compelled to act. So he creates these 2 beings from the dirt under his fingernails. And these beings are liminal, genderless beings whose names are actually ascribed to various members of Inanna's cultic personnel. So these beings descend into the underworld. They're given the food of life and the water of life. And in descending into the underworld, they request Inanna or Ishtar's body. They sprinkle the water of life. They sprinkle or provide her with the food of life. She's then resurrected, brought out of the underworld, However, in order to leave the underworld, there's a law of exchange. So that law of exchange requires that another individual take her place in the underworld. So as she journeys out of the underworld, as she encounters those individuals who love her, who care for her, who lamented her passing, she tells the underworld demons or daemons, spirits also known as Gala, that those individuals that mourn for her are not to be taken in her place. Eventually, she comes to her spouse Dumuzid, who is seated upon his throne in his apple orchard with attending slave girls dancing. He's dressed in his finery. He is not lamenting her. And she sees this. She issues the same cry of guilt that Ereshkigal pronounced against her when she sat upon Ereshkigal's throne. So in her place, her own spouse, Dumuzid, is sent into the underworld to essentially take up residence now that Inanna has departed, which leads into another myth, but that's for another time. Absolutely, absolutely. The various members of her cultic personnel, there was a specific class of cultic personnel who are known as the Kurgara, and iterations or concepts or conceptions of these roles that these individuals possessed have evolved over time. Not only were Inanna's priests and priestesses embodiments of liminality, as we understand them today, it is without a shadow of a doubt, based on the information that we have, based on the contextual resources, the historical resources, and the research that's done, Inanna's cultic personnel are essentially comprised of what we would consider members of the LGBTQ community. So these specific members of her cultic personnel that danced in revelry were either transgender men, or in some instances were considered transvestites, which is an outdated term. However, these beings bore weapons, they danced in revelry, they cut themselves, and one actually sees aspects of this today in various cultures in which processions involve individuals flagellating themselves, and this is completely outside of Western Abrahamic traditions. So these individuals in these processions, they flagellate themselves, they cut themselves, they're bleeding profusely. This was an ecstatic worship an expression of worship as part of these processions, as part of Inanna's worship. So it's interesting, we have these parallels of grief, which one, claws at one's face and lacerates one's buttocks, as the myth describes. And then on the opposite end, we have this as religious ecstasy and fervor. So it's an interesting parallel. And I think that it does speak to the liminality of Inanna's cult, in that, there's ecstasy and passion, and there's misery and flagellation. And in the middle, there's this exchange of energy with almost sadomasochistic acts against oneself. So in the mythopoetic journey in this text, there are elements, while the majority of elements are comprised of aspects of Inanna's myth, the descent myth, there are some parallels to the journey of Gilgamesh to achieve acclaim and immortality. So Gilgamesh encounters specific individuals in his quest who tell him specific things, one of them being a tavern maid who he meets at the end of the world. And she tells him that he needs to focus on living, the world of the living is what we inhabit. And immortality is far removed from us. We're appointed to be born, to live, to die, to descend into the underworld. So throughout the course of the text, if the reader faithfully follows the rituals outlined in my book, each individual god that one encounters will actually, the reader will encounter those gods, and they will read for themselves that the gods are instructing them to, leave this quest to achieve a specific aspect or element. So I don't want to give any spoilers away, and compelling or urging the reader, who is soon to be the initiant or the supplicant, to return to their life, to eat their bread, to drink their wine, to dress in clean, pure garments, and to live out the rest of their days in service to the gods. Now, to add to that, going back to the topic of Gilgamesh, the reason why I actually chose him is, or chose him to be included in the pantheon of the underworld gods, he did actually, according to literature and exorcistic texts, upon his death, he achieved apotheosis. So as a result of that, he was given a place in the underworld as a judge of the dead. So he is a benevolent judge. He's finally achieved immortality, but not so much in the sense that he expected to when he set out on his quest. If one solely focuses upon adhering or maintaining some rigid sense of what the ancient peoples did, I believe that does detract from an enriching spiritual life. So my end game is to present this material in a contemporary context. We've evolved, we've changed. Society is no longer the same as it was, thousands of years ago in the Fertile Crescent. We have medicine that is easily accessible. We have an understanding of psychology, of everything from A to Z. We have all of these things at our disposal in the modern world. Why not focus on that? Why not move forward? We can keep an eye on the past, but we can't resurrect the past. We have to move forward with what we have. So I would like to think that this is a revitalization to a degree, as opposed to reconstructing. So if one were to read the text, there's clearly a lot of material in here that's not quote unquote orthodox in the sense of that term. So there is a contemporary spin. There's some contemporary language that's used. However, I have done my best to stay true to literary forms. So throughout the text, there are two literary forms that were quite popular in ancient Mesopotamian literature. The first was a form of literature called a balbale, B-A-L-B-A-L-E. And basically, that's a rhyming couplet with changing repetitions. So that is utilized in certain ritual texts that are included in the book. The other form of literature is what's called adamanduga, and essentially that is what's considered debate literature. So that's incorporated into the book, in which in certain portions of the book in which the reader engages with the gods that are in the book, that inform a specific part of the book, that inform a specific ritual, and they're debating with that god as to what their merits are in this mythopoetic journey, why they're supposed to continue with their journey, why they are worthy of obtaining A, B, C, D, all the way through to the end. So if there's two takeaways, it's that is my drive here to bring that form of literature into the present day, and I think I've done a good job. My readers will have to come to their own conclusion after they read the book. So as someone who does have a relatively minor theater background, but has engaged in a lot of theatrical ritual, so to speak. The book is written in such a way that if circles or covens or other esoteric groups wish to use these rituals, it does allow for a theatrical element. But for the individual, the rituals are comprised of actually going through specific ritual steps, but also reading the text aloud. Studies have actually shown that intoned text or intoned words actually trigger an altered state, and this is actually used by hypnotists. So if one were to actually read the text and read these rituals aloud in the intended format, one would enter an altered state in which to engage with these gods. So there's your long and short answer. Focus of my own praxis is more of the mystical devotional work. However, I do have a keen interest in actual sorcery and magical texts. While I'm not a practicing magician, I do have experience with these rituals. And what's interesting is reading these rituals, reading these translations of these historical texts, one would find that practitioners who would engage in what we would consider the more mundane, or as I like to refer to it as vulgar magic, such as those texts that are found in the PGM, where there's compulsory spells and curses. Within the Mesopotamian context, works of that nature actually fell outside of temple sanctioned magic. So those who engaged in such activities were actually considered sorcerers and witches. And sorcerers and witches did not have a good reputation. In fact, if one was suspected of practicing sorcery or witchcraft, one would be tried, and if found guilty, would be thrown into the river. So being thrown into the river bound and gagged was not something that one would want to be found tried for, or subject to in terms of penalties for their crimes. So magic and ritual that was approved was largely that was sanctioned by the temple, that was sanctioned by the ecclesia of the time. So that's primarily where my interest lies from a magical or esoteric standpoint, outside of a devotional praxis, if that answers your question. If you were to look at the religion of each of these various cultures that comprise the Mesopotamian people, one would see, yes, there is a state religion. The best contemporary analog that I often rely on is Catholicism, in which you have Catholicism as sanctioned by the Catholic Church, that is more stately. You have, Mary, Queen of Heaven and Earth, and then you have folk Catholicism in pastoral settings, in which you have, Our Lady of, XYZ. You have, more rural iterations or manifestations of Mary. So in ancient Mesopotamia, we have Inanna, the goddess of Uruk, who was the patron goddess of the city. She enjoyed worship there. She had a sprawling temple complex. And then you have Inanna of the fields, you have Inanna of the orchards, you have Inanna of the date palm in these more rural pastoral settings. So as we find that is actually how these religions evolved. These cultural spiritual practices evolved. So they began as very rural pastoral religious practices, And then over time, as small settlements became more organized settlements, became more urban settlements, and then finally you have the bustling cities where populations were up to 300,000 people or more, that were trading with outside communities and cultures and nations. That's when we see this rise from small pastoral setting to a metropolis, a god of the metropolis, gods of cities and plumbing. And it's just, I find that the parallels to ancient cultures and what we consider civilization today are just baffling, in the sense that what we take for granted today is something that the Mesopotamian people as a whole looked to. So we're living in the age, I think, in my opinion, just as informed by what I've read, I believe that we're living in an age that they potentially would have idealized, and that civilization is all around us. The walls of the city protect its people. So the city in which I reside, I can't think of anywhere else I would rather be. I find the gods in my city. I feel more connected, and I know that many neo-pagans and other members of the esoteric community would be shocked by that, but Mesopotamian spirituality, Mesopotamian religion as a whole, was not, what we would consider neo-paganism today. There is no emphasis on worshiping nature in the modern concept or the modern context. Everything was, we're going to worship the god of this city because this god gives us the power that we need. This god has given us the gift of civilization. These gods as a whole have given us the means to take control of nature, to maintain order within the chaos that is, natural reality, natural order. But yeah, I find the gods in my everyday life in the city that I reside in. There is a manicured park that is a few miles outside of town that has a man-made hill that slightly resembles a ziggurat, and it was on that hill that the first official Mesopotamian themed ritual that I led for my pagan community was actually held. And it was there that the temple that I maintain was established. So have you ever witnessed in close proximity lightning strike? That's the only way that I can describe it. So several years ago, I was driving home during the middle of a storm, and it had not started raining. There were clouds looming. And as I'm driving, I suddenly feel like my body is being, I've got all these pins and needles, sticking into me. And suddenly the sky lights up in the most brilliant blue that one could imagine. And I feel this rumble, and I look to my left, and this enormous wave of electricity just strikes the earth. It was just baffling, completely indescribable, both terrifying and beautiful and majestic, all at the same time. And witnessing that's the only way that I can describe the experience that I have, my experience with these gods and these spirits that I feel have manifested in one way or another. For those who have been around large livestock such as horses and cattle, while these animals are largely docile, there is that element of danger that's there, especially with horses. So that's another way that I can relate my experience to others. You're in the presence of something, and you don't know if that emanation or that presence is going to behave, for lack of a better term, behave in a manner that is approachable, or if that emanation or that presence is going to behave in a manner that is dangerous and unsettling. So I don't know. That's the only way I can describe it. Both terror and awe.
Yeah. I suppose that's perhaps quite aligned with the description of the numinous, or sort of Rudolf Otto's the Mysterium Tremendum at Fasa.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in my favorite film of all time, in the Fellowship of the Ring, where Frodo encounters Galadriel, and she reveals herself, through the power of her ring and that majesty and glory. She's both beautiful and terrible as the dawn, and those words just, they stick with me. They've, embedded themselves in my psyche. So I want my gods to be both beautiful and terrible, because they're gods. They're not humans. I don't want a human experience within a human interaction. I want a human experience in the presence of a numinous being or emanation or spirit. It is, it's quite detailed. We find as the culture evolved, as the Akkadians inherited the Sumerian tradition, and then it was diffused into Babylonian culture, and then we have astronomy and astrology. We find that the focus is not so much upon the earth. The focus is drawn upwards. So we have the planets, we have the stars informing these priests, these astronomers, of the god's will upon the earth. So we have eclipses that are, or foreboding events that would give one cause to fear. And then we have the planets and the gods that oversee those planets, the gods that are the planets and the gods at the same time, that inform these priests and astronomers of the god's will for the king. So if Mars is in opposition with the earth, or if there's a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, what do the gods have to say about that? How does that conjunction affect not just society as a whole, but the power of the king over the people's lives? Because the king is the representative of the gods on the earth. And if there are ill omens, what is the outcome for that king? Do they continue living? Do they continue their rule? Or are they deposed? Or is the city conquered by an outside force? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I find that I've become more of an amateur astronomer now than I was as a child. I mean, I've always been fascinated with the night sky, but now as an adult and engaging with the spiritual praxis, my eyes are always drawn upwards. And I don't want to sound woo, but whenever I observe these planets or these alignments, or the phases of the moon, I'm always thinking, what does this have to do with my life in a spiritual sense? And what's interesting is others that I know in the esoteric community that have incorporated Mesopotamian spirituality into their own praxis, we often share the same insights. We often have the same experiences, and it's usually by chance that these are discussed, where someone relates, oh, I dreamt about this, and I just happened to realize that Mars is in opposition, or Jupiter and Saturn are in alignment, and then we discuss the embodiments of those planets in a divine sense. We have Marduk in the Babylonian tradition, who is the god of Jupiter. He's both Jupiter and the god of Jupiter himself. So what is his power what is his influence, much in the same way as Jupiter the god and his power and influence over the planet. So there's a lot of sky watching, you know, observing the phases of the moon, observing the planetary spheres. So that's definitely something that I do keep in mind and do focus on in my own spiritual praxis. While it's not so much the majority of my practice, it does complement my practice, especially on a devotional level. So if the moon is in a certain phase or there's a certain alignment of the planets, then my focus is on those gods of those planets, you know, making sure that they receive the proper devotion that is worthy of them. Would absolutely love to go. The only experience that I've ever had with that part of the world. I mean, I was born in Pakistan, and my ethnicity is from Northern Africa all the way into Pakistan. So Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. The closest I've ever been was a layover in Dubai for 18 hours. You know, that was years ago when I was much younger. If the political situation in the Middle East were to change, and outside of this wonderful pandemic we've all been affected by, I would definitely love to go. I would love to see the ziggurat of Ur, walk up those steps if possible, you know, touch the bricks. But that is something that we will, or I will have to revisit in the future. I'm gonna stand in awe of, you know, what's around me, the weight of time, you know, resting upon everything there. That's just incomprehensible to me. But hopefully 5-10 years from now, I'll have that opportunity to go and stand at the foot of that ziggurat and, you know, witness all that history. I have a little slide here that I'm going to share, and drum roll, please. So here we have the lovely image from the cover of my book. One of my friends, I had commissioned this image, and the artist of the book, Johnny Decker Miller, elevated this and made it what it is today. So these images, these details of the relief, you can see the rod, you can see the ring. We have it here in this detail from the Stela of Ur-Namah. We have it here in this detail of the Burney relief, and then we have it here in this detail from the tablet of Shamash. So these items, the rod, the ring, they have various iterations throughout history. They're either a shepherd's crook and a nose rope, they are a coil of rope and a measuring rod, or they could just be a literal rod and a literal ring. We have elements of that, you know, they're referenced in the Descent of Inanna, where Inanna is wearing the ring upon her wrist. She's carrying the lapis rod. There's actually several papers that are written about these emblems, these icons, within the context of my own book. The ring is symbolic of the earth, the earthly realm, as well as the underworld. So it's the circumference of the earth, and the rod is that which connects all of the realms of reality. It's the axis mundi. But in Mary Abrams' very lengthy, insightful paper, she writes that the rod and ring are separate objects, as you can see here, with unique characteristics. And what I find interesting is she does mention that they represent the temporal measurement of life that begins and ends, you know, with the ring representing the eternal aspect of life, as well as the rod being the symbol of power, like a scepter. And that symbol, that image, or those items, not only do they have all of these various meanings, they are only presented by specific deities. In this case, we have the god who is possibly Enlil in the stela of Ur-Namah. You can see that it is a rod and a coil of rope, or a nose rope, that was used to lead captives or prisoners of war. But what's interesting is, if we think of these symbols as the compass that that's used by Masons, or as a symbol of Masonry, these were images, or these were items that were used to lay out temples and lay out cities, and they were only used during times of peace. Because during times of peace, what are you going to do? You're going to revitalize your city. You're going to build temples. You're going to build administrative buildings. We don't see these symbols in times of war. However, caveat there, the only time this symbol is presented within context of war or battle, one of the Mesopotamian kings, Naram-Sin, is depicted as not only bearing these items, but also bearing the crown of divinity. So he's taken upon that divine aspect for himself. I don't touch upon that in my book, but there you have it. Debate, I know everyone wants to claim one goddess or another. I'm firmly in the Inanna or Ishtar camp, and the reason why I say that is because we have no depictions of Ereshkigal. Ereshkigal is an underworld deity. Inanna, however, as we know, based on my little summary of her myth, she possesses the rod and the ring. They're exemplified in her myth. The rod and the ring being the symbols of order. So in the context of the myth, she's stripped of all her power, but at the end she is revived. She ascends from the underworld. She's accompanied by these spirits. As her myth evolves, as her cultic practice evolves, we do see her take on various avian aspects. She's actually in one text referred to as having owl envoys who essentially oppress men who have left their religious duties unfulfilled. So they will actually visit these men in the night and remind them that they've put off their worship to Inanna or to Ishtar, and that in order to alleviate themselves of these spirits that plague them, they need to take up that religious devotion and praxis to venerate her in their lives. I know that some would assert that this is a representation of Lilith. However, to that I have to say, Lilith is not a Mesopotamian goddess. Shocking, I know. She's actually a figure found in rabbinical literature, and the only aspect of Lilith that we do have in Mesopotamian culture is the Lilu demons, the Lilitu or Ardat Lili demons that are the ghosts, the hungry ghosts of young men and young women who have been cut down in their prime, who've never been married, who now are hungering for a fulfilled life. So because they've been deprived of that, they will render men impotent. They will render women infertile. So they're disrupting that order. And the Mesopotamian people would not have deified these beings. The only being that would be deified would be Lamashtu, who is the closest analog to Lilith. But I'm getting off track here. My personal opinion is that this figure is Inanna or Ishtar, solely based on the iconography and Inanna's possession of the rod and the ring, whereas Ereshkigal does not have possession of those items, at least from a historical context. Your mileage may vary. Some people would assert that, you know, this figure is one or the other. That's not for me to judge. Everyone's spiritual praxis, everyone's concept of deity and reality of the gods is different. So, you know, I'm not, you know, holding people to some lofty standard. That's what Reconstructionism is. So I would like to tell people to buy my book and support my work. I believe that this labor of love is something that would be beneficial to the community, whether one is incorporating Mesopotamian spiritual current into their own praxis. For projects to come, I'm actually working on a manuscript for another book, which is in a similar vein to this book. And that book is devoted to the god Dumuzid, who, while many would see him as a minor character in the descent of Inanna, if one were to actually study his cult, the evolution of his presentation within the Mesopotamian spiritual current, there's an interesting parallel, almost a parallel to that of Inanna, from a minor deity to one who is in various realms that connect him to higher powers. After that manuscript is written, I intend to, of course, submit that to Anathema for consideration for a next book. And then after that manuscript is written, I'm going to be compiling all of my original work that was dedicated to Marduk as it relates to the Enuma Elish. So hopefully that's something else that will be published and received by my community.